I'm a retired police lieutenant from the state of Wisconsin, city of 100,000 people in the Midwest. I was the only man in history of the United States. I am to sue a sitting judge in a racial discrimination case that went to the Supreme Court of the United States and I prevailed. Prior to this, no person was ever capable and able to break the cloak of judicial immunity. What happened between me and the judge was I was raising my stature in the police department was going so high and so rapidly that my own police union sought out the judge to stop my escalation to the highest ranks in the police department. The judge's name was Judge Harvey, and he met with the police union, my union that represented me, and they asked him if he would do something to help them get rid of me off the police department. Prior to going to the judge, however, they had gone to the police chief and requested that he not promote me to the position of sergeant. And at the time that they went and requested him to do this, I was head of the police community relations section, being denied the promotion of that office, which was a stature historically had been a captain in that position. So the chief came to me and asked me if he could delay my promotion because the police union was upset and that if he promoted me, they told him directly that they would have a blue flu, which means that they will walk out and not perform their duties as police officers. So consequently, when he came to me, I refused to accept that. So what happened is I filed a complaint with the Labor Commission of the state of Wisconsin. And in filing that complaint, the state came down and did an investigation and enjoined the police department and put a cease and desist order against my own union for them to quit harassing me in the performance of my duty. That was the first step in this long legal battle that was just beginning to take seed. Subsequently, after that, they went to the judge and they asked for his assistance. The judge then went to the district attorney and asked if he would form this machination with them in order to successfully get me off the police department. One of the problems they had with me was that I was not a person of low stature. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I didn't run the streets, and I was well respected in the community. So they had to take some sort of action to justify removing me from the police department. So it was a coincidence, but it was fortuitous that something fell in place to allow them to make this attempt successful. So what happened is that one night after leaving a basketball game, I was venturing home in my car, and in front of me, I saw a robbery, an attempted robbery taking place right in the middle of the streets on a stormy winter night in the state of Wisconsin. I got out of my car, identified myself, and told the perpetrators of this crime, who I had no idea who they were, to get out of the streets. And I was a police officer, had to not get out of the street. I told them I threatened to arrest them. Well, after that, a fight ensued. After this fight ensued, I had some assistance from community people, and I was successful at arresting these people. After this arrest, the person named Dale Vorlap, who was out on prison at the time for a felony, he was on parole. He was the one that I arrested, he and his comrades. He subsequently went to the judge or to the district attorney and told the district attorney a lambasted lie that I went to his house and beat him up with a chrome pistol and threatened that if he came to court to testify, that I would kill him. So with this claim, the district attorney decided to pursue me, and he told this felon that if he would stick with this story, because he knew it was a lie, that as long as he stuck with this story, that he would not have to go back to prison. That because he would be helping them getting rid of this black police officer, this lieutenant, that they wanted to get rid of. So when this all took place, they went to the judge, the district attorney, and asked the judge if he would assemble what in the state of Wisconsin is called a John Doe investigation. Similar to in other states, it's similar to a grand jury. And the difference is in Wisconsin, when you assemble a John Doe, it's presided over by a judge and there's no jury there. So the judge has complete control. And once he has this John Doe, he does not have to disseminate or expatiate any of the information that was gathered in evidence is in that John Doe to the public, to the press, or anybody. He could completely seal it. So this is what they did. They had a late night John Doe investigation. What came out of that investigation was an indictment of me. And there was no evidence for the indictment, so he sealed them. And as a result of that, I was indicted, charged with a crime, a felony, and 2 misdemeanors. And the very morning after the indictments, the same judge that indicted me came over the radio and read the indictments. I'm indicting the highest ranking black police official in the state's history, Lieutenant Harris. I'm indicting him for a felony and 2 misdemeanors. He went over the radio and he announced this. The judge now that indicted me announced this to the press. So once I was indicted, I had to try to pursue legal help. And it's very difficult in the state of Wisconsin. Fortunately, I had some very true, dedicated lawyers that were not just lawyers of mine, but they were also friends who defended me. And in defense of me, we were able to knock down all of those indictments. And one of the things that came forth out of that revelation after they investigated what happened during that John Doe, because nobody had the right to see it, one lawyer got drunk at a party. And when he became intoxicated, he told another lawyer that had he committed the act against me that Judge Harvey had committed, that he would be in prison for the rest of his life. That subsequently flowed out of that party and got to my lawyers. Once my lawyers received this information, he went to the DA and threatened that if he did not give him the transcript to that secret John Doe, he would pursue him through the Bar Association. So once we got that John Doe, we were able to analyze it, and there was nothing in the John Doe that was sealed when they broke the seal on the indictments. But one of the things we did find out once we got into court, and this is very important because it shows the collusion that goes on in these courtrooms every day. We were able, as Exhibit A, present a letter that Judge Stotz, who was a presiding judge in my case, who dismissed the case against me, received from Judge Harvey, the judge that indicted me. And in this note, he told him, "Dear John, you have done great harm to me in this community. As I told you when we discussed this case previously, that this guy has done great damage in this community and we all want to get rid of him." He says, "Yet you found it not fitting and you dismissed these charges against him." And he says, "You have done me great harm. And if you can get up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror, your conscience has shrunk to the vanishing point. Your friend, Dick Harvey." So that's what I was up against. This is one of the things that took place, and this was the beginning of a long, twisted legal battle that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And eventually, I prevailed in the Supreme Court, and it was a landmark case, Harris versus Harvey, 605 Federal 13. I was able to prevail, and it became a landmark case.
We're with Sylvester Harris, author of A Reason for Being. How are you doing, Mr. Harris?
Doing fine, thank you.
All right, excellent. Just have a few questions. That was a great documentary. Take us back into the social conditions in Wisconsin during the time when you moved there and you kind of settled there.
Well, at the time when we moved to Racine, we made the transition from the rural South, which was really, in fact, Southern Illinois. During that time, they were really recruiting blacks from the South after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. They needed workers to work in the hot smelting foundries. And what happened is that the unions were opposed to some of the way they were being treated and some of the white workers. So they went and got another market to get the blacks to do the work that the whites didn't want to do, as they're doing today with the Mexicans. To work in the foundries, melting the iron and all the things that were uncomfortable in the workplace. So we made the transition to Racine, Wisconsin, which was the anchor for all your construction of all automobiles. American Motors was there. A lot of the companies that were building cars used Racine as a catalyst for building automotive products, engine blocks, and things of that nature.
Take us back into your early childhood coming up.
My childhood was a very difficult childhood. My mother had 22 pregnancies. Out of those 22 pregnancies, 11 of us survived. During that period of time in the South, in Southern Illinois, people don't think of Illinois as being the South, but it was because once you crossed the Mississippi River and got to Cairo, Illinois, that was a free side. If you went back the other way and you crossed the Mississippi, you were in the slave side. So during the time I was raised in Illinois, we had segregated facilities. And it was very difficult. You could not get a job. My dad worked in the coal mines, but that was a very difficult work too. And other than the coal mines, there was very little for blacks to do. And this is why that transition period was so important. When relatives moved up to Wisconsin and got jobs, they would automatically send for their brothers and sisters to come up and move in. When my dad moved up with my uncles and got established, we still stayed in the South, in Illinois. And in doing so, we took quite a while for us to make the transition. But in Illinois, it was well established. We could not be in the hospitals. We were all born at home. And if anybody died, like my mother, there was no prenatal care. So if you died, you were placed in a cardboard box. And like in many black communities, we were very, I wouldn't say tribalist, we were very community and church oriented. So everybody would come to view the body of that baby before the white people would come from downtown and take the baby back for cremation. So that was the kind of lifestyle that we had prior to moving to Wisconsin. Moving to Wisconsin was racism, but it was a different shade of blue. We avoided the signs. We could sit in any place in the show, but you could not make any progress. You could not go in certain neighborhoods. The schools were even divisive at the time. So there was a slight difference in the way that they promoted racism. One was the signs, the other was without the signs, but it was just a different shade of blue.
Explain your career prior to becoming a police officer.
Prior to becoming a police officer, I worked for the Parks and Recreation Department while I was in college. And I worked in the most difficult part of town. It was sort of a gang activity. It wasn't as acute as the gang activity we know today. There wasn't a bunch of drive-by shootings and things like that, but there was always a group of people trying to control another group in another side of town. So I was thrust into a position in the community centers where it was the toughest part of town. And nobody would come to the centers for fear of the groupies coming in, taking over the center, beating people up, and chasing people away from the center. But I stopped all that. I was able to impose my will on those gangs. I was able to give kids a free atmosphere to come in and have fun without being intimidated and driven out. So with my success in recreation, it kind of reflected a light on me. And what happened one night was that the gangs came in and tried to take over the dance. And there was a real disruption between me and the gang leaders and the people that were on my staff at the time, who really were really afraid because these guys were rough. They had guns, knives. So I got into a brawl with them. And in doing so, they chased me with a razor, bricks, sticks, and I was able to get a hold of a table that they had the cash box on. When they came in, they paid $1 to get in. I broke the leg of that table off, and I went to work on them. I beat them immersively. I beat all of them so bad they ran and got into the paddy wagon. The cops just opened the door and let them run in there. So once that spread around by the cops, how I handled these guys, they began to want to recruit me to be on the police department because they were having problems. This was during a very critical time in America when we were having demonstrations against housing. de facto segregation housing. We were demanding equality and equal rights in jobs. We wanted to open up the job market, the housing market. We wanted equal education. And so they were having a difficult time throughout the country with riots and things of this nature. So they were trying to go on this binge to recruit blacks. And another thing that came into play was that the Justice Department at that time, under Kennedy, told them that they had to enforce an affirmative action, which meant that whatever percentage of blacks you had in the community, they had to be reflected on your fire departments and the police department, or else you could petition the government to cut off funds. That played into it very deeply too. So that's how I was recruited by the police department and became a police officer.
Oh, that's exciting. And how did you meet your beautiful wife, Letha?
I met Letha in the summer of 1970 during a session in which she was visiting her relatives from Illinois. And it was a coincidence that she was born 23 miles from where I was born. And not knowing each other, but we just happened to meet at a focused place at that time. And I introduced myself to her, and she introduced herself to me, and we got the dialogue and some discourse. And eventually we got to, I got to be able to go over to a relative's house and visit with her, and we got to know each other through that.
And how did she help you get through the trial and the tough times?
Very, very difficult because she hadn't been exposed to anything like that. Matter of fact, she was so overwhelmingly shocked when she came to Racine and saw black and white couples. She had never saw that in, as I stated before, previously, very segregated in Southern Illinois. So that was something that didn't take place. And during this particular period of time, too, with all this black identity going on and black identification, and the black poets were out there spewing heavyweight poetry, and a lot of the Curtis Mayfield and all these artists were singing black songs and black identity songs. That was something she hadn't seen. And so that was a new experience for her.
Now, how did the mayor, I read in your book where the mayor approached you. Take us back to that experience.
Well, what happened was after this incident at the center, the mayor was told about it. And so my cousin was on the city council, the first city councilman at that time, black, in the history of the city. He approached him and asked him, could he convince me to come on the police department because they needed black recruits. They had a very difficult time recruiting blacks because the same thing that's going on now was going on then. Blacks were being beat brutally, falsely arrested, intimidated, and blacks in no way were considered joining the police department. So they wanted me to come in, join the police department, and be a strong recruiter for black people to come on, black men to come on the police department because they needed to meet that quota that the federal government has set down.
Were you pressured by the community and among your peers when you made that decision to join the police department?
No, that didn't happen. The pressure came after I got on because people wanted to distrust you. But I let them know when I got on the police department, I refused to wear a suit because I thought that was injurious. That the minute I came in there with a uniform on, it had a stigma attached to it. So I didn't want to be associated with that. So we worked out a program where I would come in plain clothes. The community knew me. I lived there all my life. And so I had to just reconfirm to them that I was the same man that they knew before I went on the police department. And that I wasn't going to be a straw man for the police department. I wasn't going to be there to justify any injustices that was perpetrated on them. And so once I was able to lay that down and prove that to them, I became well accepted because I didn't just work in law enforcement and recruitment. I worked in affirmative action with getting blacks jobs, getting kids jobs in the community. I worked with the NACP and other community organizations to assist blacks in getting loans. We set up programs in banks where blacks could get loans in banks. So my position was not just in law enforcement. I worked throughout the whole community in trying to get justice for us in every phase of life in the city.
And how about your fellow police officers, particularly the ones of, how many African American cops were there?
When I got on the police department, there was 2 black police officers and 1 black police recruit who was really a junior officer, really a community service officer. So once I got on, I was able to recruit a total of about 15 black men to come on the police department. So that boosted the police personnel, the black personnel, to about 18 black police officers.
And did you get a lot of, I mean, initially when you first started, even before you began to get cited for promotions, did you run through a lot of jealousy or a conflict with your fellow officers?
Yeah, what happened is that once I became a lieutenant, in order for them to promote me to lieutenant, they had to go and put together a scheme so it wouldn't insult or inf- uh, infer the wrath of the police union. What he had to do was they had to do a complete restructuring of the police department so they could promote some white officers so they wouldn't be so mad because they had to promote me. Keep in mind, there was no black ever reached the attain the position of sergeant until I was able to attain that status. And so, in order for them to even do that, they had to do a complete reorganization of the police department. And they weren't satisfied with that because the position that I was in as the head of the internal affairs and community relations officer was headed by a captain. So they lowered that to a lieutenant. So that was another move to try to keep them happy. But once I got that, they kept going to the judge, asking him to assist them. They had these prolonged police union meetings. And eventually, what happened was that the black police officers, I felt like I was Dr. Frankenstein after he made the beast. They turned on me in order to get acceptance by the white police officers, who, by the way, when they first went to a police union meeting, they asked them what the hell they were doing there. So they they would see me after I got them on and got them jobs. They would see me in my office. They would turn and go the other way. As a matter of fact, they would go into a steep trot to get away from me because they were trying to bind with these white police officers. It would never happen and was going to never happen. And it happened today. As a matter of fact, in order for them to try to get rid of me on the police department, one of the other steps that they took was they had a company come in called Touche Ross to do an evaluation, and they were called in by the police union and the city to try to get rid of me. They had to justify it through an investigation, and the result of that investigation was the complaint that the police union had was that there was too many blacks being promoted, and that the opportunity for promotion was being denied to white police officers because affirmative action had firmly put in place the opportunity for blacks to be promoted and not whites. Keep in mind, I was the only black sergeant at the time and the only black man to reach the status of lieutenants. So they were still complaining about reverse discrimination. And as recently as this year, the police union once again had a consultant firm come in to evaluate why white police officers couldn't get promotions because they were being denied because they were through affirmative action, they were promoting black men and white women. Keep in mind they have a black police chief, one black sergeant, and one Mexican lieutenant. And they feel they were being denied opportunities for promotion.
Wow. So your actual position was community relations officer?
My position was I was the commander of the community relations and internal affairs.
Mm-hmm.
However, they told the chief that they would not be investigated by a black man. So they had to assign a white captain to work with me in the evaluation and the investigation of complaints against police officers.
Well, and so prior to the Valop case,
The Volab?
Volab case, and the ticket tampering, were there any other false allegations previous?
Oh yeah, they had a white woman come up who was a prostitute, and they told her if she would come up and identify me as raping her, that they would not charge her with a crime they had committed, or they charge her with prostitution that night. They took her up to the staff officers meeting to where the staff pictures were posted, and told her to pick me out, and stated I was the one officer that raped her. And when she got up to the staff officers' pictures, they told her to point me out, and she says, I won't do that. She says, that guy is the nicest guy in the police department. He's helped me so many times. So I'm not going to be guilty of doing that. I'll maybe point out somebody else, but I'm certainly not going to point him out. So those are sort of the things that went down. They had another guy who had a business across the street from me. He had a 7-Eleven type business, and they told him in the investigation, they went across the street and told him that if he would say I tried to rob him, that they would get him a job on the police department. They told another guy that if he would say that I tried to rob him, that they would get him a job on the police department. And if they would support the allegations by this, in the Vorlap case, that they would get him a job as a police officer. So I was constantly being subjected to that kind of a situation.
Now, you had a run-in with Mr. Volop, and he admitted to you that he was pressured from the police department to lie and to
Yeah.
come up with those false claims?
Yeah, Vorlap pulled he snatched the cap off of him one day when one of the guys that worked with me, we were driving the car, a squad car, and we saw a guy going down the street running stop signs. So we pulled him over. Normally I don't pull people over, but for some reason I pulled him over. And lo and behold, when my guy came up to me, the guy the guy that works for me, my partner, he told me, he said, man, that's Dale Vorlop. He said, he ain't got no driver's license. He went up and down the street running stop signs. And he says, I don't know what you want to do. So I got to arrest him. I said, no, don't arrest him. They'll think this is something we provoke. I said, we just take him home and tell him not to go on the street anymore. So that's what we did. We took him home. And in doing so, he told me on the way home, he said, look, man, he says, I heard from everybody how nice and what kind of good cop you are. He says, and I want to tell you something right now. I never would have made those claims against you if they not promised me that I would not have to go back in prison. He says, instead of giving me prison because I was on parole, they gave me probation. He says, you know, he knew himself that it's impossible for a man to be on parole and probation at the same time. So he said that he would give my lawyer a statement that they provoked him or they promised him all these things if he would stick to his allegation against me. And so he did do that. He gave my lawyers a statement under oath that they told him that if he would do these things and assist them in getting me off the police department, getting me indicted, that he wouldn't have to worry about ever going back to prison.
What's your take and what's your thoughts about Judge Harvey and his motivation, a guy that you hardly ever met? What do you think motivated him to come after you in the way that he did?
Well, Judge Harvey wasn't a avowed racist. I mean, it was well known in the community. As a matter of fact, once he found that these charges weren't going to stick, the whole white community got together and put a petition together to support him. And it was a newspaper, the only newspaper in town, the major newspaper, outside of the labor paper, was a paper called the Racine Journal-Times, which the judge had preferred stock in. They ran a 2-page, if you take a newspaper and unfold it into 2 pages, they had a 2-page ad that was supported by the community and signed, and money was donated to the judge to assist him in getting rid of me. And they stood out in front of the benches like the Salvation Army does in the wintertime, in the summer, Christmas time with a bell. They was out there collecting money.
You gotta be kidding.
Yeah, we support Judge Harvey in all his endeavors to get rid of Sil Harris, Lieutenant Harris.
So you had the power of the bench and the power of the media against you. How did the media play its part in trying to bring you down?
As I stated, the media was controlled by him. They were all afraid of him, and they went along with everything he said. You're talking about a very racist community. It wasn't just the district attorney's office involved in this and the judge. They had a meeting at the judge's house, a dinner meeting, in which the probation and parole, the public defender, the district attorney, and all other facets of the Justice Department in the city of Racine had a candlelight a dinner at his house. And at that dinner, they invited 2 people from the investigative unit from the state, the state investigative crime unit, that investigated corrupt officials, public officials. They brought them in to try to convince them, once the charges were dismissed against me, to initiate some charges from the state level against me. And so what happened is that they denied one of the U.S. attorneys there at that time, he was U.S. attorney, said that, look, you got more power than me. You're a judge. You've already indicted him. The indictments have been dismissed. We're not going to get involved in what we see as a local community conflict. And so we were able to get that knowledge from the U.S. attorney. He submitted an affidavit to that effect that he had gone to that meeting.
The assistant DA, somehow the assistant DA was also a part of the conspiracy?
Well, what happened with the assistant DA, his name was Rob Weber. He went to high school with me. And when he found out what they were doing to me, he disagreed with them. And they weren't going to take Volab to court on these charges. So what he did, he said, well, I'm going to take these charges, and I'm going to charge him with it. I'm going to take him to court. So it was so hostile towards him that he had to move out of the office, out of the DA's office, and go to another office, because he said he was going to go carry on and go forth with these charges. And so once he decided that, he went through with it, and we convicted him again of another felony.
Wow.
And he still didn't go back to prison. So that's the kind of instrument I was up against, the kind of machine that you can work with. And it's just not unique to this community. This goes on in the criminal justice system throughout this country when it relates to black people and poor people.
After you took the case to the Supreme Court, and take us just through that real quickly and how you felt after you won that case. You remember that day? You remember how you felt that day?
Well, when this case went to trial in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the federal court, Judge Byron Gordon was the presiding judge. There was no way anybody thought we would ever prevail in this case because of the judicial cloak of immunity had never been pierced before. Notwithstanding the fact that we were seated, and this case was seated with an all-white jury of ultra-conservative Wisconsin. And so the possibility of us winning was so distant. And that was what we went into that court realizing and praying for, that we could have some success. And in doing so, we saw great emotion in these people in the jury. These white people were sitting up there crying in the jury box. Because when they found out what these people had done to me, they found it beyond belief. And they were so moved by it that they found the judge guilty of racial discrimination. Now, keep in mind, a judge in the federal court charged with racial discrimination and goes back on the bench. And the Judicial Commission of the state never removed him, nor did the U.S. Attorney or the Justice Department. He went right back to work, charging black people, put them in jail, and white lawyers in that community took them before him, and he convicted many of them, put them in jail. That's beyond belief. It's unparalleled, unheard of in the United States.
And reflecting on what you all went through, the victory, the experience, what would you like to see, and how would you like to reach folks with your documentary? How do you envision?
Well, I like the story to be told because this is a unique story. And it's the same thing that happened in 1865. This case began in Wisconsin, Racine, Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin. It's the same state that the Dred Scott case began in. And the 13th District U.S. Court in St. Louis ruled that Dred Scott could not have any standing in court because he was not considered a human being. He was three-fifths human. And they ruled against him, and he had to go back into slavery. 100 and some years later, I go into this same federal court, and they prevail on my side and said that I did have standing, that I was a human being that had every right as a citizen of the United States. That's the uniqueness of this thing and how it ties in. 1865. That far back, and Dred Scott was victimized in the state of Wisconsin, and he fled that state and went to Illinois, and they still had slave catchers come and get him and put him back into slavery.
Wow. And several years forward, there is a police commissioner today is going through a similar situation or experiencing the same type of racism that you did back during your time as a lieutenant.
Yeah, the present police chief is black, and he is catching unlimited hell. And any black man that ever gets on the police department, I don't care what they tell you. You see all these black people now, they got them as police chiefs. They ain't nothing but figureheads. They scared to take a position on justice, on right. So this black police chief in Racine, they after him like white on rice. He's going through the same thing I went through 40 years ago, 30-some years ago. He's been accused of promoting blacks over whites through reverse discrimination. And as I stated previously, he's the only one that's black, the chief. They got one black sergeant and one Mexican lieutenant. Yet there's affirmative action problem and discrimination against whites in promotions.